see this timer here?
Is that what's doing it?
I guess so. I'm not sure. I've never had the issue before, but I'm hoping like once the PowerPoint starts that it won't do that anymore.
Yeah, let me try something. Just do something. I'm gonna try if it's the. You know what I'm wondering? How do I get to the taskbar? Here, I'm wondering if it's. How do I
So I've
search?
had to turn it back on like a couple of times already.
There's a projector. You know what I'm looking for? You've done that?
Projector? Oh,
Projection settings.
I wonder if somebody changed it. It's on never,
Yeah, I know. That's what I was looking for.
so that's really weird. I don't know why it keeps turning black. And then it totally turns off of right left turn and just goes to clear.
So we have a minor problem.
I'm hoping it
summarize?
stays on. Yeah, it.
How do you get it off the black?
Go over here, click on that, and then push that. But then,
It's still black on the screen. Oh, there we go.
yeah.
Yeah, but
so
then I know it'll go to sleep.
see that?
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's what's doing it,
I know.
or if there's something wrong with that. Totally off of right leg turn. Like it shuts off of right leg turn. I don't know. Hopefully,
Yeah,
since
let's
I woke
just
it up
follow
a
it.
couple of times.
Yeah, you know what? I'm not going to tell them either because I don't want it in his.
No. But if it happens, I have a controller in the back, and I'll push the button.
I'm going to be watching it.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming out on this cold night that may turn snowy, but hopefully not before we leave. I saw the schools have already declared that they're canceled tomorrow. I grew up in Massachusetts. I'm learning the culture down here. If you don't know me, my name is Patrick Spiro. I'm the relatively new director of the George Washington Presidential Library. I came in July, and really thrilled and excited to welcome you all to our kickoff Forward Evening Book Talk for 2024. We have a great talk. Former fellow is with us tonight. But before I get there, I just want to do some housekeeping, some announcements for some of the things that are happening here at the Presidential Library. So first off, our next Forward Evening Book Talk is February the 8th. David Waldstreicher has written a book on Phyllis Wheatley. She was an African-American poet who wrote during the age of the American Revolution. Washington was familiar with her work and even corresponded with her about it. And so this is a book on her, and it's on February the 8th, David Waldstreicher. The book's The Odyssey of Phyllis Wheatley, A Poet's Journey Through American Slavery and Independence. We're also hosting a number of daytime programs here as well, and I want to let you know about two of them. The first is a brown bag on January the 23rd. We're here for brown bags, bring your own lunch, and we feature the work of some of our resident fellows, staff members, or people who have a work in progress. And on the 23rd, we're having our fifer, Don Francisco, who spent many years in the military as a musician and is here now as our fifer on site. And he's going to talk about the music of the American Revolution and perform for us as well. So that's January 23rd at lunch. Bring your own lunch here. And then our lunch at the library, which is also a lunch but not a brown bag because we provide you with lunch if you come. That's on February the 13th, and I'm really excited about this lunch at the library. It's about a portrait that had hung in the French ambassador's house for many years. It's a portrait that looked like a Charles Wilson Peale of George Washington, but nobody was sure who had actually done it. And then a group of art historians using new methods and technologies were able to confirm and attribute this portrait to Charles Wilson Peale, identifying another Peale of George Washington that now sits at the French ambassador's house in Paris. One of those art historians is coming on February the 13th to talk about the techniques and technologies they use to make that attribution. I think it's going to be a fascinating talk. So that's on February the 13th at lunch at the library. But here tonight, we're here to hear Michael Blaakman talk about his newest book. Michael comes to us from Princeton University, where he's an assistant professor and the David L. Reich University preceptor. He has his PhD from Yale University, and I saw that you conducted some research in Yale. I was looking at your footnotes and some of the images at Beinecke, not surprised. But he conducted research also all around the East Coast in the United States, some stuff in Philadelphia, and of course spent time here as a fellow working on this book. So it's so great to see one of our fellows' books come to fruition and see the world. And in fact, he came back this summer to work on his next book, which is going to be a fascinating biography on a loyalist. And you're not going to talk about it tonight because you're going to come back soon with the book and give us a talk about that one. But tonight, I'm really excited to introduce Michael Blaakman and his book, Speculation Nation, Land, Mania in Revolutionary American Republic.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here on this wintry night. It's really an honor to be back at Mount Vernon, where I have come again and again over my decade or so in the history biz. I'm grateful to Pat Spiro for having me, and to Stephen McLeod. I'm grateful to Al Montgomery for producing the live stream, which is a thing, and to really all the staff at this incredible library. I think of this place as sort of a second intellectual home that I love coming back to. I feel like I am never as productive a writer as I am when I'm here at Mount Vernon. In fact, some pretty significant parts of the book that I'll be talking about today were written here when I was kind of a baby grad student. The good parts that made it into the final book, were written either across the courtyard here in the Fellows Wing, or actually really enjoy writing in the garden across the street next to the mansion. So it's really wonderful to be back here. I am going to start this evening with a house. which I'd like to take a few minutes to read, kind of like we would read a historical document. It's a big house, as you can see. It's a rambling, rather ostentatious house. It's kind of an awkward house. It sits in a tranquil village in northern Connecticut called Suffield. And in the late 18th century, this house was owned by sort of a bumptious former tavern keeper named Oliver Phelps. Now, during the Revolutionary War, Phelps had worked as a merchant, selling provisions to the Continental Army. And in 1788, the year he bought the early part of this house, he partnered with a Massachusetts politician to buy a government claim to 6 million acres of Iroquois or Haudenosaunee land, which is today much of New York State west of Syracuse, for $1 million. Now, that scheme failed in the space of a few years, but in the meanwhile, Phelps had invested in lands in Kentucky, in Virginia, in Vermont, in Ohio, in Georgia, so he was speculating in lands all across the new nation. And in the midst of these purchases, he bought this house to kind of match his mounting prospects. It announced that he was a man on the rise. And upon moving in, he added coins, that's coins with a QU, wooden blocks resembling stonework, to the corners of the house. You can see them here towards the left, to kind of lend it a greater sense of substance and weight. In this squat wing in the foreground here, Phelps opened a land office where he kept track of his investments. He sold parcels to fellow New Englanders. And then in 1794, he doubled the house's size. He added intricate cabinetry, fine paneling, and most impressively, I think, this French wallpaper. This was imported from the depths of revolutionary France. And he had it pasted throughout the entirety of the new wing, both the public rooms where he would host visitors and also the private rooms, like the bedrooms upstairs. You can still go to Suffield and see this wallpaper, and the effect is dizzying, it's dazzling. That's exactly what he was going for. So this house was, I think of it as a real estate magnate's architectural statement. We might call it the sort of Trump Tower of rural Connecticut. That said, although Phelps was trying to place this home at kind of the cutting edge of refined taste, his renovations also made it feel kind of lopsided. The new wing, as you can see in this photo, kind of sits a little bit further back from the old wing, so the house didn't really fit with the symmetrical conventions of its age. I think passersby would not have mistaken this for a house that was built, out of whole cloth, according to the sharpest standards of fashionable taste. And then somewhere inside, this really gets me, somewhere inside, Phelps hung this portrait of himself, in which he holds an envelope with his name on it. He wanted you to remember who he was, but apparently he understood that people also needed to be taught who he was. So he had this kind of didactic portrait done. It was a bit gauche by the standards of 18th century gentility. So what I'm getting at is that this house, the things Phelps furnished it with, all of them sort of smacked of new money. Or maybe even new money is a little bit of a stretch. Because really, Phelps's entire empire was built on credit. He had bought a lot of land, but he had as yet sold almost none of it. So his house, the furnishings, the seemingly boundless amount of credit he could command, all of it was aspirational. It was made possible only because it seemed certain that his land investments would translate into inestimable wealth in the very near future. Now, you all will probably be unsurprised to learn that they did not. Meanwhile, payments are coming due, creditors are pressing. Within a couple of years of the renovations, Phelps had to mortgage the house, and then he locked himself inside it to avoid getting hauled off to debtor's prison. And in 1802, he moved to Canandaigua, New York, where he lived out the rest of his days, kind of attempting to resuscitate his name and his fortune. But Phelps was not alone in the extent of his speculations. Far from it, in fact. In the quarter century after American independence, thousands of Americans bought huge amounts of land in the hopes of reselling it at a profit. Land that was recently seized from loyalists, land that was recently stolen from Native Americans, or in many cases, they bought basically claims to huge amounts of land that were still inhabited and truly owned by native people, but were sort of within white settlers' sights. This was a period, the 1780s and the 1790s, when it seemed like anybody with capital or access was getting involved in the land business, when people are sort of buying and selling tracts at a bewildering rate, when fortunes were being won and lost, apparently overnight. The land market's rewards seemed so certain that it led Phelps to build that incredible house before he had made much money at all. It led people to leverage large land deals upon the profits they expected to make from other speculations that were still in progress. It led some failing financiers to try to speculate their way out of insolvency from within the walls of debtor's prison. You might even call it a mania. And in the 18th century and ever since, many observers have done just that. In the 1780s and the 1790s, people used the language of mania to describe the sort of unprecedented scale and intensity of the land business. They called it a madness, a rage, a mere drug. In a Philadelphia magazine in 1798, one writer framed this historical moment quite succinctly. This is a quotation I've gotten a lot of mileage out of. He wrote, "The land mania is a frequent disease in every part of America." It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but you get the point. "It broke out," he continued, "with peculiar violence in most of the states immediately after the peace in 1783, and has continued to be more or less the epidemic of our country ever since." I think Oliver Phelps's house kind of stands as a sort of monument to this era of maniacal land speculation, an artifact of that iron faith in astronomical future success. And so that's why I chose to start with this house today. The book I'm here to share with you all this evening is it's a political and cultural history of land speculation in the wake of the American Revolution. It's a history of the United States' first real estate bonanza. It's a story of ambition and corruption and capitalism and statecraft that stretched really from Maine to the Mississippi River and from Georgia to the Great Lakes. This book is my attempt to answer a handful of questions about Phelps and his contemporaries, his ilk. Why did a so-called mania for speculation in expropriated native land sweep this new American republic? Why did they buy so much land? Why did U.S. governments, both state governments and the national government, sell it to them in such, incredible quantities? And what does this all have to tell us about the meaning of the American Revolution and about the character of the young United States? So I'll try and offer a little bit of a preview this evening. Land, the idea, the promise of land, had really extraordinary power in the Revolutionary era. Although the majority of territory that the new nation claimed under the 1783 Treaty of Paris was actually owned and controlled and governed by native people, Euro-Americans nevertheless placed tremendous faith in that land's ability to solve some of the problems that plagued their young republic. And patriot leaders thought that land could help them achieve two goals or solve two problems in particular. The first was the challenge of paying the hefty costs of the war for independence. The revolution had begun in large part as a tax revolt, right? So patriots knew that they couldn't count on taxes to foot the whole bill for the war. But as they saw it, land was their new nation's most abundant resource. It could be doled out to soldiers in lieu of cash, or in a break with British precedent, it could be sold to pay down the nation's war debts, to fund their new governments, to generate sort of a lasting stream of public revenue. So that's goal number one. The second goal that patriot leaders hoped land sales could help them achieve was to expand the kind of citizenry that could sustain a republic. 18th century Americans understood that republics were fragile things. They thought they required a rough equality of wealth because drastic inequality was seen as, fertile ground for despotism. As Noah Webster put it, an equality of property was the very soul of a republic. And the rationale behind that idea was basically that republics lived or died according to the citizens' political virtue, according to their personal independence. And in order to be politically independent, the thinking went, you needed to also be economically independent. You needed to not be subject to the will or the whim of a landlord or a boss. This is why there were property requirements for voting, well into the 19th century in some states. So the ideal Republican citizenry was a broadly equal society of landowning farmers. And this is a sentiment that's kind of captured in some of the earliest American landscape paintings like this one. With a growing population, though, maintaining that kind of society, a society of propertied farmers through the generations, that's going to require more and more land. But in the eyes of revolutionaries, of course, who expected native people to retreat and eventually to disappear, the land available for the taking seemed basically infinite. There's a moment at the Constitutional Convention where a South Carolina planter named Charles Pinckney kind of articulates this idea. He said, "The vast extent of unpeopled territory," it's kind of wishful thinking there, "the vast extent of unpeopled territory would ensure more equality of rank and fortune in America than in any other country under the sun." Now, initially, it seemed to patriot leaders, achieving these two goals, paying for the creation of independent governments on the one hand, and expanding a Republican society of landowning citizens on the other. Initially, they thought that both those goals actually required preventing land speculators from engrossing all of this real estate at low prices. So during the first few years of American independence, state and national leaders, land policies at both levels of government, all across the new republic, all these people tried in one way or another to exclude speculation, to prevent land speculators from acquiring land. Instead, across the new nation, governments tried to sell public lands in really small kind of farm-sized tracts, 100 acres, 250 acres, and directly to ordinary settlers. The idea was that they were going to divvy them out in sort of perfect size parcels for a generous family farm. So the question is, how did the new republic go from that populist plan for a broad distribution of expropriated native land to a nationwide mania for speculation by the likes of Oliver Phelps? That is the central drama of this book. You're going to have to read it to get the full picture. But I thought I'd take the rest of our time today to share two stories with you. Two stories that offer a taste of what the book argues, and I hope also maybe a glimpse into the process of researching it. So first is the story of a single scrap of paper. It's this piece of paper. It's a tattered little coupon about the size of your palm. It lives in the state archives in Frankfort, Kentucky. As you can see, it's pretty dingy. It's pretty ragged. It's ephemeral. It's ephemeral. It was not made to last 250 years. It's a military land bounty. And in the summer of 1783, when this piece of paper was still crisp, it was issued by the state of Virginia to Charles Robinson, who was a 40-something private in the Continental Army. Now, Robinson had spent most of the war at Fort Pitt, present-day Pittsburgh, where he was part of a regiment made up of settlers from the surrounding region. And from their outpost at the forks of the Ohio River, these troops waged, during the war, pretty vicious campaigns against native communities aligned with the British, and they worked to court their own native allies in the Ohio country. Sometime in the course of these efforts, on behalf of the Patriot cause, Robinson was wounded near his right shoulder, maybe during an attack on Shawnee or Delaware villages in 1780 or 1781. We don't exactly know when he was wounded. We do know that he spent his final few years at Fort Pitt unfit for active duty. So this coupon that he received entitled him to a land bounty of 200 acres. And that land was eventually going to be located somewhere in present-day Kentucky, which at the time was a crucial hunting ground for British allied Shawnees and Cherokees. Now, I should fess up, there's nothing particularly special about this coupon. I chose it pretty much at random. There's tens of thousands of others just like it, both in the Kentucky State Archives and in other state archives across the country. But taken together, I think, all of these coupons illustrate a key element of that populist plan for using land to fund the creation of an independent American republic. Across the United States, Patriot leaders, cash-strapped governments, they tried to convince ordinary people to fight for the cause or to continue fighting for the cause by promising to reward them with land and with the political status that property ownership bestowed. So Charles Robinson's military bounty was partial payment, basically, for nearly 6 years of wartime service to a revolutionary state that had really little else with which to compensate him but other people's land. But there's a few flaws in this plan. First was the land's location. As I mentioned, it was deep in present-day Kentucky, towards the western end of the state's current boundaries. That's 400 miles from Charles Robinson's home. It's also deep in the heart of Indian country. And this is an era when Native nations west of the Appalachian Mountains were tremendously strong, when they ruled their territories as independent sovereigns. So settling on lands that they had not, willingly relinquished, as this voucher entitled Charles Robinson to do, it's a pretty dangerous proposition, and Robinson, it turns out, was not that interested in it. The second flaw in this plan had to do with the fact that the Revolutionary War was followed by a pretty severe economic depression. What Robinson and many of his fellow former Continentals really needed was cash, not land. So almost as soon as these coupons were issued, veterans started selling them. And I should note, they did not sell them for particularly strong prices. Revolutionary era governments were pretty weak, right? It was unclear whether they would ever be able to fulfill the kinds of promises that these certificates represented. Whether the state of Virginia would ever be able to dispossess Cherokees and Shawnees and make the Kentucky district safe for white settlement. So when veterans sold these bounties out of necessity, they often sold them for really a pittance. And as a result, bounty certificates circulated really widely throughout the early American economy. They came to function basically like a kind of money, and aspiring land speculators eagerly bought them up. Now, Charles Robinson's land certificate is a great example of this. The next slide I'm going to show you is the reverse of this same piece of paper. Just 2 months after receiving this thing, Robinson signed it over like you used to sign over a check, maybe in exchange for goods or maybe to settle a debt, to one Francis Holland. And Robinson, who was illiterate, certified the sale with his scribble in lieu of a signature, a jagged 2 here that I think maybe hints at the wound in his shoulder where, according to a surgeon, part of the bone remained loose. The bounty was sold again 3 weeks later, and then again and again. Over the next 15 years, it changed hands at least 5 more times and was finally pooled with 8 other bounties to yield one speculator a tract of 1,300 acres near Bowling Green, Kentucky. As a material artifact, this slip of paper, the certificate, shows evidence of all of this exchange, right? You can even kind of see it here. You can imagine the pockets and purses into which it was stuffed, smudging its wax seal on the other side. The hands that unfolded it and refolded it so many times that it tore into thirds and had to be eventually taped back together. Now, 1,300 acres might not sound like a ton, but multiply the story of Charles Robinson's land bounty times tens of thousands. With paper promises like these, revolutionary governments had intended to pay for the war by committing to divvy up native territories in small tracts that would go directly to ordinary settlers, especially Continental veterans. But elite speculators basically short-circuited that plan. They purchased these IOUs by the fistful on the open market, and then they redeemed stacks of them to assemble huge land holdings. 3,000 acres here, 50,000 or 100,000 acres there, lands that they anticipated could soon be resold for wild profits. Now, many at the time believed that this was no morally neutral path to riches. We might be saying to ourselves, like, well, that's how the economy works. It's a problem of supply and demand. But at the time, I want to note, people criticized this traffic in land bounties. In fact, they argued that what it did was it changed the revolution's meaning. It meant that the benefits of the revolution would not go to ordinary veterans who had sacrificed for the cause, but to land tycoons and merchant magnates, plunderers of the needy, as one critic alleged. There's in the course of researching this book, there's a 1785 poem that I ran across that's nestled in the back of a Pennsylvania newspaper that I think kind of captures the heart of the matter. I'll read this little stanza for you. Then ask, for whom in summer's heat they glow, for whom they shiver in the winter's snow, for whom half naked scout from hill to dale, whilst thirst and hunger cruelly assail. We're talking about the soldiers. For us, the speculators answer, sure. For us the soldiers all their toils endure. For us the state shall special statutes frame. Let soldiers and yeomen be content with fame. This is maybe not the heights of literary prowess, right? But the political critique was certainly clear. Nevertheless, this traffic in land bounties, these paper promises conditioned on eventual dispossession, was a major part of what fueled the booming real estate market that swept the New Republic. Between land policies designed to fund the Revolutionary War through conquest, this post-war economic depression that I mentioned, and native resistance that made many would-be settlers think twice about moving west, land bounties like these became a hugely enticing object of speculation. One speculative venture, called the Pennsylvania Population Company, used bounties to amass something like 400,000 acres north of Pittsburgh. This is a map of their holdings from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and the map goes from Pittsburgh is a little blue, down at the bottom up to Lake Erie at the top, and that's Presque Isle up in blue there. And the Pennsylvania population's massive land holdings built on this traffic and bounties are the portions shaded in red. So there's really an immense amount of land. They weren't alone, the Pennsylvania Population Company. For William Bingham, who's kind of a suave Philadelphia merchant, one of the country's wealthiest men, for him, bounties like Charles Robinson's were part of a scheme he cooked up to buy all the land he possibly could, 4 million acres or more, he estimated, he aspired to. So, mania indeed. Bingham actually brings me to the second story that I wanted to share with you all this evening, one that's not just about a populist plan gone awry, but is also emblematic of the kind of corruption that runs throughout this book. This story takes us from Kentucky to Maine, which was then a district of Massachusetts. Like other states, Massachusetts hoped to sell the frontier lands it claimed, Abenaki lands and Penobscot lands, for public revenue and to address its hefty war debt. And also, like other states, Massachusetts originally hoped that these territories the state claimed as public lands would actually be sold broadly and directly to ordinary farmers, not elite speculators. As one Mainer wrote in a Portland newspaper in the 1780s, the genuine spirit of republicanism required that lands be distributed in small quantities. So you get a real sense of that early populist vision. The state of Massachusetts created a committee to try to handle this work, a lands committee. It actually turned out to be a pretty lousy, wildly ineffective committee. Founding era folks could be just as bad at bureaucracy as 21st century Americans. This committee's membership and purview were constantly shifting. They were pestering the legislature with kind of workaday inquiries that they should have been able to handle on their own. They struggled to sell many tracts at all in Maine or to collect payment on the few tracts that they did sell. And by the way, we can kind of give them a little bit of a break because, as you can see from this map of Maine, drawn in 1794, they were working with really terrible geographic knowledge. I mean, it's hard to sell lands in 100-acre tracts when this is your starting point for how you understand the geography of the Maine interior. In 1786, this committee tried to kind of stoke the effort by announcing a lottery for lands between Mount Desert Island and the New Brunswick border. This is a really beautiful stretch of coastline. The idea was that every contestant who entered this lottery would win some kind of land, but a random drawing would determine how much, from a modest farm, 50, 100 acres, to the grand prize, which was going to be more than 20,000 acres. Here, by the way, is what the lottery tickets looked like. The lottery was meant to favor actual settlers. It was meant to kind of substitute a bit of populist gambling for elite speculation. but it totally flopped. It's really it's a real bummer of a story. The lottery was announced in the midst of this continuing economic depression, as well as the political turmoil of Shays' Rebellion, and in the midst of rumors that the Penobscots were planning to attack Maine settlements to prevent further invasion of their homelands. So out of this grand ambition, only a sixth of the tickets were actually sold. So the Lands Committee is really just doing like a really pitiful, terrible job. By 1790, it was costing the state more money than it was actually bringing in through land sales. So that year in 1790, Governor John Hancock of Massachusetts, who's always kind of a merchant at heart, started urging his fellow state officials to sell these lands in Maine much more quickly to benefit the public coffers. And speculators around the country started catching wind, among them Henry Knox and William Dewar. Now, Knox, of course, is pretty familiar, right? He had been a bookseller in Boston before becoming an artillery commander in the Continental Army. By 1791, he was the 41-year-old Secretary of War in the Washington administration. His partner, Dewar, a little bit less well known, was a New Yorker. And although he was a little bit older than Knox, I think he was the closest thing that the late 18th century had to a finance bro. He was kind of, he was young, he was ambitious, he was stylish, he was kind of short on skill and wisdom, but he was long on swagger. Dewar was a financier. He was a pretty ruthless bond speculator. He was a financial power broker. He was also kind of a bon vivant. He threw these lavish dinners in New York City where, according to one impressed guest, he served no fewer than 20 different kinds of wine. Dewar had been Alexander Hamilton's assistant secretary of the Treasury, but in 1791 he had recently resigned in order, he said, quote, to do better for himself. So there's a little sense of Dewar's personality. When Knox and Dewar learned that Massachusetts was likely to start selling Maine lands, wholesale rather than at retail, they hatched a kind of a shady partnership and started angling to land a massive deal. They had lots of competition, but within a few months, they managed to get the state to sell them 2 million acres at 10 cents each. Those are numbers so nuts that it can be kind of tough to conceptualize, tough to wrap your mind around, right? So let me put it this way. That's more than 2 Rhode Islands for $200,000. Now, when I was researching this purchase, at first I couldn't understand why the Lands Committee, previously opposed to speculation, would agree to it. And I also couldn't understand how Henry Knox and William Dewar had managed to beat out their competitors and land this massive deal. I uncovered the answer only when I started reading letters by their agents that were not obviously connected to the sale. Over a handful of months, it turns out, their agent in Boston was writing to members of the legislature, offering them, positions in the officer corps in the United States Army or positions in the federal government. One was offered the chance to become the military's top doctor. Another was given the possibility of assuming the postmaster generalship. These are all appointments that Henry Knox, as the Secretary of War, was in a position to influence or outright bestow. Some key legislators were actually greased with shares of the venture, things that are indicated in the letters by subtle references to joining our concern. This is a pretty bald-faced attempt at bribery. I had missed it at first because the agent actually confined talk of the lands and of these appointments to separate letters, fearing that his correspondence would be opened and read en route, as 18th century mail often was. But once I started reading more of this collection and lining up the letters kind of against each other on a timeline, the strategy was it was totally unmistakable. It also clarified some of what was going on in some of the more cryptic parts of the correspondence between Knox and Dewar and their agent in Boston, such as when they instructed him to, quote, secure an interest favorable to our objects, or when they encouraged him to be cool. That's a direct quotation. Be cool. Don't appear too eager. Be smug and don't let it slip through your fingers. This was, in short, a coordinated campaign of graft, a deliberate attempt to go over the Lands Committee's heads and kind of bend Massachusetts land policy towards large-scale speculation. And it totally worked. It was a wild success because despite the land committee's continued commitment to a more populist approach, the legislature ordered it to sell 2 million acres to Knox and Dewar. And then the next year, after some more bribes, they got 1 million acres more. Here, by the way, is a map of the lands. This was printed to market these tracts to foreign investors, especially British bankers. And two things that I want to point out about this map. First is in a kind of a neat encapsulation of the degree to which large-scale elite speculation was overtaking that prior plan for a more egalitarian distribution of land. Part of Knox and Dewar's purchase, the part on the right here in red, encompassed every unawarded acre of the failed 1786 lottery lands. They just kind of swooped right in and took that region over. Second thing I want to point out is that actually only 2 of the 3 million acres is actually depicted on this map. The second million-acre tract is in the top left. The third million-acre tract wasn't even known well enough to draw on a map. You could try, but it wouldn't actually mean anything. This land remained mostly a financial figment of the investor's imagination. So I think this map captures how land speculation was reaching new heights of financial abstraction in the 1790s. It was pushing some Americans to think about land in new ways, as pure capital rather than a place that one could visit and farm and use and map and know. This kind of speculative opportunity stemmed from the historically specific circumstances of the Revolutionary era, right? Young and cash-strapped governments claiming millions of acres at their disposal, but kind of unsure how to dispose of them, struggling, even desperate, to make land sales a pillar of statecraft. To land speculators, this seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and William Dewar certainly saw it that way. By 1792, William Dewar had landed in debtor's prison, a result of several other speculations gone wrong. He desperately tried to remain involved in this Maine purchase, hoping that it would win him a ticket out of prison and back into solvency. But payments to the state were coming due, and so the venture was kept afloat only when the very same William Bingham swooped in with an infusion of capital, a fortune that he had initially made through privateering, but was going to use to come to the rescue of a different but kind of equally cutthroat kind of business. Now, Knox and Dewar and eventually Bingham's partnership was just one of dozens of similar schemes that were being launched across the Republic during these years. In 1787, while the Constitutional Convention deliberated in Philadelphia, Congress, kind of the B team of national political leadership that made up Congress in the summer of 1787, Congress meeting in New York sold 5 million acres it claimed in the Ohio Valley to 2 speculative companies. The next year, Massachusetts sold 6 million acres. That's the Phelps purchase I began with. New York sold 4 million acres a few years after that. These were tracts so vast that it could be hard to imagine them as places with specific features, places where things grew and people lived, especially for speculators who never planned to personally set foot on the lands they bought and sold. It was easier and basically sufficient to think of these places simply as numbers on a on a ledger. One syndicate, the North American Land Company, gives a really good example of this. The North American Land Company claimed 6 million acres scattered across 6 states, and they marketed shares in their holdings of 200 acres each. Acres in this case not representing any particular spot of earth, but rather a denomination, an abstract kind of portion of the company's common stock. Between 1787 and 1795, the span of just 8 years, U.S. governments sold some 80 million acres to land companies like these, throwing that prior vision for a more populist land policy to the wayside. So addicted had they become to the idea of raising public revenue by selling land to speculators that in a lot of cases, governments sold huge tracts in regions that everybody recognized were still fully owned and governed by native nations. This development is an important part of the book. It's kind of the apogee of early national land mania. And it's especially reflected in a land purchase that some of you might have heard of before, the Yazoo land fraud in Georgia in the mid-1790s. To put some more technical language on this development of selling land that the United States didn't actually govern, they were developing ways to financialize even unceded native land. In a sense, these were futures contracts, a right to eventually own land that white Americans coveted, but that in the moment, US governments did not actually govern on the ground in any meaningful sense. So these are preemptive land sales, and they were a new kind of financial instrument in the 1780s and 1790s, a literal investment in the future of American expansion that unleashed speculation across vast new swaths of the continent, and crucially, I think, made eventual Indian removal part of the land speculators' bet. Now, as you can all probably surmise, this maniacal early national land business was shot through with risk. Many of the schemes launched during these years were deeply precarious. They depended on credit. They were highly leveraged. They were premised on a very clear set of ideas about population growth and immigration, about future demand for these lands, ideas that suggested that demand would eventually be infinite, that it would be insatiable. But that demand didn't actually materialize as quickly as speculators hoped, so that's another risk. And then finally, many of these ventures concerned indigenous homelands that Native people were loath to relinquish. From the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee in present-day Western New York, to Miamis and Shawnees northwest of the Ohio River, to Cherokees and Creeks in the southeast, all across the North American interior, Native nations vehemently denounced US claims to their territories and these kind of speculative sales. To give just one example of what their opposition sounded like, one Creek leader named Alexander McGillivray straight up laughed at what he called the haughty Republicans who vainly imagined themselves masters of the New World and thought they could seize with impunity every foot of territory belonging to the natives of America. McGillivray went on to vow to, quote, keep the Americans within bounds. This kind of sentiment, this kind of forceful opposition to US expansion, it had helped to stymie those early populist plans geared towards actual settlers. It had helped to kind of prompt that turn towards large-scale speculation, towards relying on speculators who focused on future settlement and future profits. But as the years went on, in the 1790s, Creeks and other Native nations continued to repel US invasion with really striking success. And in the process, they prevented a lot of speculators from reaping the financial rewards that they had envisioned. Combined, all of these risks got a lot of speculators into pretty deep trouble, especially during the sort of late 1790s, when a transatlantic credit crunch sort of brought the nation's first wave of maniacal land speculation to a sobering end. A Massachusetts senator named Theodore Sedgwick delivered the headline in late 1796 when this kind of financial crisis was beginning, when he wrote grimly, "The bubble of speculation has burst." In every city on the eastern seaboard, Sedgwick reported, elite speculators were landing one after another in debtor's prison. Towering men were being toppled by what Sedgwick called the prevailing mania. There's some jails that were, prominent in the era. Philadelphia's Prune Street Jail, New York's New Jail, places that became essentially crowded dorms for bankrupt land speculators. These men included some of the nation's leading lawyers and merchants and statesmen, people like Robert Morris, the Continental Congress's first superintendent of finance, or James Wilson, one of the first justices of the Supreme Court, scores of others who shared these men's ambitions and their misfortunes. Despite these failures, though, this real rash of bankruptcies in the late 1790s, land mania had deeply significant implications for the meaning of the American Revolution, and its consequences were likewise profound. And this is what I'll end on. Two kind of concluding thoughts here. First is that for roughly a century, Historians of the American Revolution have, I think it's fair to say, fallen into one of two broad camps. Some historians argue that the revolution extended political and economic opportunity, that it was, in the final calculus, really a democratizing project. But there's another group of historians who contend that actually the revolution ultimately consolidated elite, individual power and wealth, that what began as a people's revolution ended with a revolt of the elites. In the book, what I suggest is that the new nation's speculative bonanza in land reveals that these competing interpretations are actually two sides of a single coin, a coin that was to be forged through native dispossession. Let me explain a little bit more. American patriots, as I've been saying, staked the success of their revolution on the seizure and public sale of native land. And when the initial populist plans for those lands proved unworkable, elite speculators worked their way in because they saw a chance to chase their own fortunes by selling the idea of landed independence and the economic opportunity and political equality that it represented. In other words, they tried to profit off revolution by making the eventual fulfillment of a yeoman's republic, a property democracy, their business. And the prospects for financial gain in that idea seemed so certain and so urgent, so immediate, that land became a mania. Second concluding thought is that land mania had really lasting consequences. Because in partnership with revolutionary governments, land speculators, even the ones who went belly up, managed to convert millions of acres of native land into private commodities. And that would be a form of property that long outlasted their own individual schemes. From the traffic in public securities, redeemable for land, bounty warrants like Charles Robinson's, to these massive backroom deals by the likes of Henry Knox and William Dewar, the attempt to use native land to fund American independence and revolutionary statecraft spawned, I think, an enduring model of expansion, a distinctive form or variant of what scholars call settler colonialism, a form or variant that in the book I refer to as a financialized frontier. And what I mean by that phrase is a historical process in which the promised profits of financial speculation in land become their own impetus for continual Native American dispossession. Not just the need for land to settle on immediately, but the eagerness to convert land into a financial instrument. This model of expansion would define the United States for generations to come. It deeply informed the Louisiana Purchase, for instance, something I could talk more about during Q&A. It continued fueling westward expansion through the era of Jacksonian Indian removal and beyond. Eventually, in fact, this approach, this attempt to financialize land, inspired copycat schemes, speculative companies that saw land as a financial investment all around the 19th century globe. And along the way, more and more, people learned to think about land as speculators did in the 1790s, not just as a place or a resource, but as a commodity, as a financial asset, as an abstract measure and source of wealth. So in 2024, any American who has, a mortgage that gets sold between banks every few years, or who counts on home equity to support them in retirement, or who aspires to own a home but is locked out by the recent spike in real estate values, or who rents their home from one of the burgeoning number of hedge fund landlords, anybody with any one of those experiences is, I think, in a certain sense, living in the world that Oliver Phelps and Henry Knox and William Dewar and their fellow speculators helped to create. The era of land mania, I think, fused the early American dream of property ownership, the kind of rustic Jeffersonian ideal, to financial capitalism. And this, the book argues, is a central and defining legacy of the American founding. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. A fantastic piece of art. What's the story on that?
The story here is that images of land speculators at work are tremendously hard to come by. The first time I was here as a research fellow, to give you an indication of how long I've been working on this book, was the summer of 2024. So this thing was a long time in the making. And in all those years of archival research, I never found something that I thought could be a perfect image for the front of this book. Two things came close. One is a plat from Georgia that has some scribbles of land surveyors on it, but this is a book about speculators, not surveyors. The other is it's a print from the late 1790s in Paris of a group of Parisian kind of bourgeoisie who were trying to invest in American lands in the Ohio country, but they're so obviously French that I couldn't put that thing on the cover of a book about American land speculation. So I was having dinner with my brother, who's an artist at one point, and was kind of complaining about this problem and how I didn't know what the heck to go on the front of this book. And he suggested, you know what, I can draw you something. So my brother drew this to try and capture what a land speculators conclave might have looked like in the 1790s. There is a bit of archival truth in it, though, which is that the map that they're gesturing towards is a real map, a 1750s map of North America that during the 1780s and 90s, people following the land business drew in the tracts as they were sold. And the map lives in an archive at the University of Southern Maine in Portland.
So we will take some questions. We've got mics, so just raise your hand and the mic will be passed to you.
So this process of dispossession was ongoing for decades and decades and centuries. And I mean, you can count on maybe hands and feet the number of times when lands that were seized were subsequently restored to Native people. But there are active political movements today to try and reclaim portions of it to help support Native communities in the present.
Absolutely fascinating talk. Really looking forward to the book. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about, you mentioned that difference between British colonial land speculation and post-independence. We know George Washington's involved in speculative efforts like the Ohio Company. What was that difference? What made this independent American speculation different from before independence?
This is a great question. Thank you so much. For me, the main difference is this financial component, that in the New Republic, land speculation becomes as much a financial enterprise as a settlement scheme. I would describe much of those land companies from the 1740s and 50s, 60s, and early 70s as primarily settlement schemes that do intend to, they're run by like a group of, Virginia gentrymen, for instance, in the case of the Ohio Company of Virginia. But their plan is actually to eventually settle the land. That's not the case for a great many of the land speculators who are involved in the business after American independence. For them, their primary goal is oftentimes just to flip the land to other speculators. A lot of them want to sell it to other American speculators, but tons of them also want to be able to sell it to European financiers, Dutch bankers or British bankers, British merchants, the like. So the one difference is kind of the goals that they're starting out with. The other difference, I think, is just in terms of the sheer scale. I mean, the land companies of the 1760s and 70s, some of them reach into the millions of acres, but if I were to draw, a line graph of the number of acres that are involved, it really would spike shortly after American independence.
In your book, you do spend some time talking about how the land was taken away from the Aboriginal owners. And those two ways were A, conquest, and B, disingenuous treaties, which were not enforced, which were taken away, a number of things. It's not really a question, but do you have any thoughts on what impact between which of those ways got done and how much of it got done might have been influenced by the desire of George Washington and like-minded people to have a standing army? And were any of these Aboriginal wars used to further that device as opposed to maybe using disingenuous treaties.
So what I'll say is that these two approaches to acquiring native land, conquest, especially based on claims that come out of the alliance between many native nations and the British during the Revolutionary War, conquest on the one hand and purchase and cession or dispossession by treaty on the second. That's kind of a transition that happens in the 1780s. Right at the end of the American Revolutionary War, Native people are not involved, are not invited to the Treaty of Paris, and are not involved in any of the agreement that was built there. Nevertheless, Patriot leaders immediately after the end of the war started insisting that Native people had lost the Revolutionary War and that therefore the new nation claimed their lands by right of conquest. This is kind of a crazy thing, given that although the British had been defeated on the battleground, it's really hard to say that about most of the native nations who participated in the Revolutionary War. So patriots initially say, well, we've conquered you and you have to just sign away these lands for free. But over the course of the 1780s, a lot of native nations, through just persistence and intransigence and resistance, disprove those claims to conquest. And so by the early 1790s, by the era of the Washington administration, national political leaders say, you know what? Okay, we'll acknowledge that your lands are not conquered, but we're going to insist that you're within the legal boundaries of the United States, and that we, whether the we is the states, the state governments, or in the case of much of the Trans-Appalachian West, the federal government, we have the exclusive right to purchase your lands, meaning that we're not going to be in competition with anybody else to try to drive up the price. At the time, that approach, purchase and cession, or the sort of treaty process, was touted as a more humane, more peaceable approach. It was also seen as more fiscally prudent, since in the eyes of Washington and Knox and scores of others, it would prevent the United States from getting embroiled in really costly frontier wars. But over the course of the late 1780s to 1790s into the 19th century, the process of purchase and cession or dispossession by treaty proves as effective, if not more effective, an approach to dispossession as outright conquest. The vast majority of lands that the United States eventually claimed were claimed through purchase and cession. And oftentimes the reality of a national standing army posted outside of the building where negotiations with native leaders are taking place helps to make that approach to dispossession as effective and pernicious as it was.
I just got to follow. I was thinking more of the Washington's Indian Wars with Harmless and Clare and Wayne, and how did Washington use that to further the standing army? I mean, that opened up massive capital of the state of Ohio.
Gotcha, absolutely. So this war, which is kind of a war without a name, a lot of scholars call it the Northwest Indian War, and it runs basically, it kind of sparks into gear in like 1786 to 1787, and it concludes in 1794, 1795. It's a war of dispossession waged by the new republic, especially in the Ohio country, northwest of the Ohio River, and it's a direct result of Shawnee, Miami, Delaware, other native nations' insistence that no, in fact, they had not been conquered and their lands had not been claimed by conquest as a result of the Revolutionary War. I'm not sure if I would say that that Washington used that conflict to try and establish a standing army, but certainly the Army of the United States in its infancy was expanded and developed and kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, kind of jacked up precisely because of that ongoing conflict.
I have a question about the falling apart of these schemes. When all these large landholders went to debtor's prison, to whom did all of the land go?
This is a great question, and oh my gosh, it was such a mess. It's a dreadful mess. What happens to these speculative landed empires? I should mention, by the way, that when they're put in debtor's prison, they still actually maintain their land holdings in a legal sense. The whole idea of putting a debtor in debtor's prison was to force them or their relatives or their own, affiliated debtors to try to like squeeze some cash out of them to pay a debt by the person who had sued them and landed them in debtor's prison. So when a land speculator winds up in debtor's prison, they still have the legal title to the lands that they claim. They are oftentimes, because they're in this headspace of absolute certainty that these lands are someday going to be profitable, they're really convinced that land should be the last thing they offload in an attempt to get out of debtor's prison. In fact, I read a bunch of letters between this one guy. I'm not sure if I can keep his name at the tip of my mind right now. He's in debtor's prison in Philadelphia. He's from Virginia. He's getting all these letters from his brother being like, just sell the stuff. Like, would you rather be, with your family and friends outside of a debtor's prison? Or would you rather be, I think he has a wonderful turn of phrase, like an emperor locked within a Bastille, referring to the idea that like you can keep that stuff, but you're not going to get out of debtor's prison by clinging to it. Eventually, in most cases, what happened is that people entered. They either just sort of distributed land holdings to their creditors, or they entered formal bankruptcy proceedings that were meant to accomplish that for them, to distribute their assets among lenders. And what happens then is that these huge land holdings they've assembled get divvied up to all kinds of different lawyers and bankers and merchants and other kind of business associates. They get splintered up, and in the process, the titles get totally screwed up. You get people claiming, Pat sold me his 2,000 acres. No, he sold me his 2,000 acres because, we each had competing claims against him. This sets up a disaster zone where in many regions that had been kind of milled through this era of land mania, in many regions well into the 19th century, land claims, including an ordinary farmer's title to the land that they live on for decades, are deeply uncertain. In Northwest Pennsylvania, well into the 1840s and 50s, sometimes people would just get someone knocking on the door saying, I actually got your land as a result of Robert Morris's bankruptcy, and you're going to have to leave. So I guess let me just put one more point on this. The irony here is that if land speculators were trying to profit off the idea of yeoman self-sufficiency and independence, this idea that's rooted in independent land ownership, the disastrous toppling of their ventures ultimately destabilizes and undermines that exact same idea for a lot of ordinary Americans.
Excuse me, I had two questions. Now I have three. The first question, the literal reading of the warrant would seem to indicate that it was up to the warrant holder to actually go out and locate and decide which 100 acres they wanted, survey it, and then do the best they could to delineate it. Is that true? The second question is, it's obvious that the supply of land far outstripped the real demand. Were they expecting a mass influx of newcomers to the new country to purchase it? And the last question is, how was the food and accommodations in the debtor's prison?
Food and accommodations were pretty good. In fact, at one point, Robert Morris, who had like an apartment in the Prune Street jail that he had outfitted with pretty nice furniture, he hosted George Washington for a dinner inside debtor's prison. The first question about surveying is absolutely right. The idea, this was kind of a regional difference. The idea was that in the southern states especially, was that a system of individual choice and divvying lands up according to natural features like creeks or, that hemlock tree was the most efficient approach and the most kind of democratic and neighborly approach. So in southern states especially, that's how land was divvied up during the 1780s and 90s. It's a system called meets and bounds survey. Plenty of other people thought that was total baloney. I mean, it leads to crazy amounts of overlapping claims. There's one image in the book of a small spot in Kentucky where this kind of meets and bounds irregularly shaped surveys chosen by individual claimants looks like 52 card pickup. I mean, you have land claim upon land claim intersecting and conflicting with each other. Land speculators tended to prefer the type of advanced rectangular survey that you get in the Northwest Territory, that you can see outside your airplane window anytime you're over the Midwest, where lands are, drawn on a map and divvied up and parceled out and sold from a distance. You can do it from the comfort of your townhome in Philadelphia, as opposed to having to traipse out to a region you probably never intend to visit anyways. And the second question was about demand. Yes, this is something I talk about in one of the chapters in the book. There was a really strong set of, this is an era before Thomas Malthus, right? This is an era when people think in their sort of Enlightenment optimism that there's really no ceiling to population growth, that populations will continue to grow and expand as long as there are resources to support them, and that there will always be more resources to support them because we're in an era of progress that encourages mobility and liberty and good government. And these are all things that encourage people to go out and proliferate. And they got pretty numerical about this. There's a widely cited statistic in the 1780s and 90s that says the American population was going to double every 20 years. And for the first, couple of decades of the United States, they weren't actually that far off. That said, a lot of land speculators thought that it was actually going to be much faster than that. So some of them start saying, no, it'll be every 5 years, it'll be every 10 years that the population will double. That did not come to pass. And it's that kind of mistake, especially when we're talking about how populations grow in particular regions where they're investing. It's that kind of mistake that leads to a lot of them being unable to sell land at the prices they envision as quickly as they hope.
A quick question about George Washington. You had said that he had made his money or his speculation in the previous era, but he was obviously around during this time. Did you come across anything that he had any comments on it?
Absolutely. So Washington's a big, I didn't write this into the talk. I thought about doing it, and then I thought, no, I'll just wait for somebody to ask it during Q&A. Washington is a big thread throughout this book. In the early chapters, the earliest chapter, which is about it's kind of the prologue chapter. It's just before the Revolution. He's a big player. He acquired much of his land holdings, which ultimately amounted in the West to something in the neighborhood of 50,000 acres. Acquired a bunch of them as a result of serving as a British officer in the 7 Years' War, and then during the 1760s and the early 1770s, purchasing other fellow officers' bounties, granted to them by the British imperial state. Problem was that the British state also said in 1763 that they couldn't actually acquire those land bounties west of the Appalachian Mountains. This is a policy known as the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And for some historians, this contradiction that the British Empire is going to give me land as payment for my service in the 7 Years' War, but is not going to actually allow me to take ownership of it. For some historians, that contradiction helps explain why Washington and some other members of the Virginia gentry signed on to the idea of American independence in the first place. Washington holds on to those land claims. During the war, he's obviously not doing very much with them. During the 1780s, he starts trying to lease some of them. At that point, obviously, British restrictions on westward expansion have been lifted by independence. In the 1790s, here's the interesting thing. He starts going really against the grain. At exactly the moment when all of these members of the new nation's elite are diving headfirst into land speculation, Washington actually starts trying to pull out of it. Beginning sometime around 1791, he starts trying to sell all of these land claims. And he has a really tough time of it for reasons that I don't particularly understand. He might just have chosen poor people to sell it to. But one attempted sale after another falls through because somebody can't pay. The question is, why is he moving against the grain in that direction? Why is he kind of at odds with the spirit of the times? This is a question I talked about a lot with some of the staff and fellows here when I was in residence back in 2014, and they gave me a couple of great answers, hypotheses. All it should be said. One was from fellow and Mount Vernon regular Bruce Ragsdale, who suggested that maybe he was trying to offload some of the land in the West in order to help fund the kind of enlightened model farm that he was really trying to build up here at Mount Vernon, to reinvest in what he had going on here. He didn't sour on the idea of the West or westward expansion. He was like a lunatic for canal projects well into the 1790s, but maybe he didn't want a personal stake in it anymore himself. Mary Thompson suggested that maybe he was trying to offload these lands in order to help build up a little bit of a pool of cash in order to eventually emancipate the people he enslaved and Martha Washington's slaves. I would add a third explanation, which stems from this story about land mania, and specifically about how the period of land speculation that I talk about in this book changed the meaning of land ownership at this scale. Washington was interested in orderly westward expansion, and he was also kind of a throwback to an earlier idea of what land ownership meant, more of like a patrician feudal kind of idea. That's why he starts in the 1780s, not by trying to flip those tracts for a profit, but by trying to lease them out to tenants. And I think he also reserved some spicy language for people who tried to profit off of the chaos of speculation in the West. Those people he called land jobbers. He reserved the word speculator for people whose methods he thought were unsavory, even though he himself was a land speculator. So I think a third explanation is that he had come to see the land business as kind of degrading and beneath him because it had become such a financial industry fueled by kind of paper fictions.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I saw.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah. I saw a lot of hands still up there, which I think is a testament to your research and your book. And in fact, Michael is going to be signing books. They're for sale out there. And if you have a question for him, it's a great opportunity to buy a book, get it signed, and ask him a question then.
Perfect.
I just want to add one little footnote to your final answer, which is this summer we acquired a letter from Washington, 1784, in which he's talking exactly about his Western land and a desire to have tenants there for long tenures. And so it's really speaking directly to what you just answered. That's a new acquisition here at the library.
I'm going to have to see it next time I'm here.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Michael.
Thank you all so much for coming. Stay warm tomorrow.
That's me trying. Are they based on people or are they just inspired by?